What does it mean to think that intellectual humility is a virtue? What could that possibly have to do with learning and knowledge? Well, actually, if you think about it, intellectual humility is the precondition or even the essence of learning, because it's about knowing that there's a lot more to know than you already do know, and perhaps that some of your more cherished assumptions can be put into question. This doesn't mean a lack of convictions or deep thoughts or commitment, but it means that in any argument, you might actually lose that argument. You may, in fact, even be wrong about your assumptions and presuppositions, or you may have a less than complete knowledge of the subject matter. Perhaps a great model of intellectual humility is Socrates, the ancient Greek philosopher, who famously said that what he knew is that he knew nothing, and epitomizing the sense of knowing what you don't know characterizes the way he conducts himself in the dialogues that Plato wrote, featuring him as a rather fearsome and relentless debater with other philosophers of his time. Socrates' humility might have more to do with not being too sure about what you know, but still willing to debate it to see what truth might come out of the crucible that discussion and argument is. Another of my favorite thinkers, the Renaissance philosopher Michel de Montaigne, best known as being a skeptic and questioning almost everything, encapsulated this notion of humility in an emblem he cast for himself, which featured a pair of scales to weigh things on, over which were written the words, "What do I know?" followed by a question mark. And that was his philosophy. What do I know? Question mark. And then weigh different ideas, ones against the other, to try to come at to what is the best answer. Of course, this is also what drives science, because science is both a form of knowledge that assumes that it is progressive and building on itself, but also provisional and can be put into doubt. In fact, what makes a great scientist is being able, on the one hand, to ask the questions that may be so simple that no one else has asked them, like Newton asking why does the apple fall from the tree, and coming up with the notions of gravity and the like, but also that these notions can be put back into question at any time as we develop things. So even if Newton's notion of gravity makes common sense and was understood to be truth for several hundred years, Einstein showed more recently in his theory of relativity that gravity can warp space and time, and so we get into a dynamic function which was never foreseen by Newton, and in fact wouldn't actually occur to us except in more extreme circumstances. So what scientists do is follow the evidence where it leads them, and that is really the key element of intellectual humility. It's also not being afraid to ask those kind of questions that are seen naive or even dumb. I'll give my own example. When I went to college, as many people are, you were one of the smarter kids in your high school, if not the smartest kid in high school. Didn't have to work all that hard maybe, and suddenly you get into difficulties. In my case, it was calculus class where I couldn't get beyond the first 3 or 4 steps in the problem. Finally, I got up my nerve and asked the professor how to solve this, and he said to my shock and surprise that you don't need to solve an equation going from top to bottom. You can go from the bottom and work back up, or you could start in the middle and work both ways. So the answer was that there are many ways to look at a problem, and the answer, the quest is to get to the solution of that problem in whatever way that might be, and it may mean thinking about it in a completely different kind of way. Questioning assumptions or following out evidence that seems contrary to what you think it is can give a sense of a great deal of uncertainty. And perhaps it's not simply the uncertainty of things that matters so much as being open. And that's what I mean by intellectual humility, being open to the possibility that things might look or be very different than what they seem to be. And that is why intellectual humility could be considered a virtue in the curriculum.